Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar on data, digital transformation, and responsible use of artificial intelligence in the humanitarian sector. Since we have 1 hour, I will be very sharp. My name is Ümit Seven, and I will be moderating today's discussion. We are delighted to have such a diverse group joining us. We have graduate students, we have staff, we have also external participants working for different aid organizations registered for this event. Thank you so much for taking time to be here. So before we begin, let me introduce our speakers. From the Humanitarian and Conflict Response Institute, I have two colleagues, Roisin, whose research on data revolution in the humanitarian and development sector was published almost a decade ago and still yet resonates strongly. The questions she raised then remain just as urgent and relevant today. And Nimesh, whose recently published work on data creation, brings a fresh and timely perspective to how we handle the data in the humanitarian space and more. I am also honored to be joined by Magan, Naidoo, the World Food Programme's first ever Chief Data Officer. This is a role created to lead the development and implementation of World Food Programme's data and artificial intelligence strategies. Magan brings data expertise from large-scale data transformations across the private sector, and at World Food Programme, he is laying the groundwork for responsible AI adoption in humanitarian operation. This is a particularly timely conversation because World Food Programme has recently published its digital business transformation plan for 2025 and 2028. This is a major 3-year initiative to modernize the organization's technology systems and build scalable, interoperable platforms. Magan has also authored WFP's Global AI Strategy for 2025-2027, the first of its kind across the United Nations. Magan, thank you so much for generously sharing your time and expertise with us today. Here is how the session flow, just some sort of housekeeping notes as well. So I will hand over to Roisin. She will set the scene for her research, and then she will hand over to Magan. Magan, for a conversational exchange on how digital transformation and responsible use of artificial intelligence are playing out in practice at WFP. And then Roisin will also pose questions to Magan. Next, Nimesh will present his work on data creation and lead a cohort short discussion with Magan. And then I will collect all the questions through chat box. So feel free to write your question into the chat box at any time. I will collect and review them before sharing them with our speakers. With that, let me hand over to Roisin to get us started. Roisin, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ümit, and thank you everyone for being here. It's very interesting to have this conversation now. As Ümit said, just over 10 years ago, my colleagues Bertrand Tays, Roger McGinty and I wrote a paper which explored the promise of humanitarian technology to kind of revolutionize humanitarian action, especially in terms of the gathering and use of quantitative data. And this was inspired by a project that we worked on at the time that was looking at the collection and use of peacekeeping data in Darfur. And it was a direct response to what we saw of the claims being made about the potential of data to transform humanitarian practice. And we called that paper Data Hubris with a question mark to reflect what we saw as the kind of excessive confidence in the sector about the power of data to be transformative, a phenomenon that's been termed kind of techno-optimism. So in that paper, we looked at the kind of 3 main claims that were being made on behalf of technologically advanced humanitarian information systems, that they can access data more accurately, more quickly, and that they have the potential to alter power relations in emancipatory ways. And those were what we saw as the kind of 3 key claims being advanced at that moment in time. And our analysis, we described it as a snapshot of a fast-moving field because there were so many data initiatives kind of starting up at that time and also ending at that time. But what's really interesting to me is how many of the issues that we highlighted in the paper are still persisting today. So data was certainly being collected more quickly, but whether they were more accurate or more empowering was less clear. So our key findings really were that technologies replicate existing power asymmetries. So the digital divide, access to technology, is hugely variable, with the most remote areas and the most vulnerable communities often being the ones with the lowest level of access to technologies to contribute to data initiatives. We also saw that this kind of data revolution, a huge rise in technocratic specialists around data who often sat in headquarters, further kind of centralizing power in the humanitarian system at a time in which kind of the trend was towards localization, or at least rhetorically the trend was towards localization. And while there was often a kind of espoused participative logic in which local communities would kind of feed data, their own data, into the humanitarian machine, either through crowdsourcing or by being emunerators or kind of subjects of traditional surveys, they still had very little design or leverage of the deployment of the technology and the use of the data. And then finally, kind of on the replicating existing power asymmetries point, the very infrastructure and platforms for the majority of these initiatives were owned by powerful tech corporations. And while many of the services were being offered kind of open source and free and freely available, there was very little interrogation of this dynamic in terms of its kind of either sustainability, at any point that free availability might be removed, or the kind of ethics of working with large tech corporations and what that might mean for the humanitarian sector more broadly. The second area of our findings was that there was very little clarity over what data was collected, how, and for what purposes. And as a kind of correlate to this, what harm this might pose to communities and individuals. If you don't know kind of the scope of data collection initiatives taking place, then you can't possibly know what harm that might pose to communities. So we saw huge amounts of data collection initiatives at all different levels of organization. So there's kind of multiple data collection initiatives that are overlapping. But the information gathering capabilities of humanitarian organizations far outstripped their capacity to analyze that information. So there was a huge amount of data being gathered and then kind of sitting there and not doing very much with it, or people not knowing how to analyze it for use in operational decision making. And so the analysis piece of the picture was kind of had much less investment than the actual gathering of data. And many of the developments in the digital humanitarian space seemed at the time to be driven by what was possible in terms of the technology rather than what was needed in terms of humanitarian action and response. And so actually the kind of excitement about new technologies that offered new ways of collecting data, sort of crowd mapping, crowdsourcing, and so on, satellite data, was kind of leading the charge rather than humanitarians saying, well, our big data challenge is this. And so we need infrastructure and support around this area. And subsequently, research has highlighted that some of that data that I've conducted as part of the same project highlighted that some of that data collection put people at risk, especially in conflict contexts where there was a high level of government repression. Anyone sharing data with humanitarian organization came under scrutiny. As I said, we were looking at the context of Darfur, and we found this to be one of the key challenges in that space. But also that research highlighted that data sharing is an ongoing and persistent challenge. And we're not just talking about data sharing between humanitarian organizations, although that is a big problem, and the replication perhaps of multiple kind of data sets that cover the same ground across the humanitarian organizations, but even within organizations, data is siloed to different departments who do their data collection and then kind of hold on to that data. It's not shared horizontally or vertically within those organizations. So our conclusion was that there was the enthusiasm for data vastly outstripped the capacity to meaningfully analyze it. And so are we generating useful knowledge, or are we generating data for data's sake? And what we described at the time was a kind of technological gold rush within humanitarianism. And we took a historical approach and showed that this wasn't unique to that moment. This had happened before. And my concern is that it feels like we're again there with discussions of AI in the sector. Are these technologies going to replicate existing power structures? Is expertise being further centralized in the hands of technical specialists in headquarters and centers of power? Does it offer the opportunity for meaningful participation by affected communities in decisions around their support? Is it built on the back of large private and for-profit corporations, and what safeguards exist in relation to that? And are we being driven by what's needed in the sector or what's possible in relation to AI technologies? Do staff have the time and expertise to understand how AI and data are used and constructed? Do organizations know what they're doing with it and why they want to do it? How do we address the kind of core problems with data sharing vertically and horizontally across the sector, including the kind of perverse incentive that exists against sharing in many contexts? And has the potential for harm from these systems of data collection and potential AI tools added on top of that been kind of seriously thought through and considered? So for me, the challenges with data 10 years ago are very much still kind of the same challenges. There's a massive optimism about the potential of data, which leads to increases in data gathering, but the gap between what data is collected and what data is used remains. And communities are now becoming a kind of data resource. But are they benefiting from this meaningfully, or are there potential harms that they might face as a result of that? Who is benefiting from these data initiatives? So data collection creates perverse incentives and it poses ethical questions. And all of these, I think, are exacerbated by the conversation about the potential for AI in the sector. So Megan, I suppose the question I wanted to pose to you and kind of give you the opportunity to talk about is, do you recognize these trends and challenges from your experience in WFP? And how have you approached addressing them in relation to both data, but also ethical AI adoption?
Roisin, thank you very much for those questions. Thanks very much for setting the scene and all that awesome work you did over the years and those leading questions. I can relate to pretty much all of them throughout my career and more specifically in my current role. So, and I think the one thing that's clear, as you said, the questions are the same. It's just the answers, are perhaps not there or different. But those types of questions have been out there for the longest time, independent of industry. Perhaps they become more acute in the humanitarian sector, given the nature of the work and the nature of the data. So first off, from a data point of view, absolutely we're dealing with it. As Ümit gave me that really great introduction and my journey with WFP, the World Food Program, as many of you know, has been out there for a long time, I think some 60 plus years. So it operated within a particular context that, made sense at point in time. The organization is distributed across more than 80 countries in the world and often has to respond to emergencies. So it's always in very much in emergency mode, which makes it hard to be thinking about the sorts of things you call out. How do you look ahead and how do you provision? Because it's all about, our motto is saving lives, changing lives, and that's the prime objective, and everything else is secondary. But now that we stand back and look at our journey and all those many years of doing this good work and collecting the data, we have that challenge question, as you've noted in many of your questions, well, what do we have? How do we use it and how do we leverage it and how do we protect it, right? So now, over the last 2 years and a bit that I've joined the organization, the thinking has shifted away from silo-based thinking, those data silos and data separation comments you had earlier. Absolutely, those existed and still do to an extent. But at least throughout the organization, starting at the top with our senior leadership and throughout the different levels, there is now appetite to change that behavior. So that's, I think, the first good thing for the organization. There's a recognition of the problem, and now that we need to address it. And it won't be an easy one to fix, or one that, I could have fixed in the last 2 years, but we made good strides in it. One, we have a global data strategy for the World Food Program. So it's the first time the organization took a global or an enterprise view on data and shifted away from silo-based thinking of, I just need to do something in a particular country and that's all I need to worry about, and then forget about it afterwards. So a little over 2 years back when I joined, we crafted the global data strategy, which is not just a technology strategy, but an organizational strategy. And we were very careful to ensure we consulted the depth and breadth of the organization. So we get everybody's perspective, and it doesn't look like yet another technical project that others can't relate to, or the technology team is trying to self-serve. So there was a lot of support, and I think that made it very successful for us. One of the things we did through that intervention was make data literacy a mandatory course. I mean, at the time, we only had, I think, 5 mandatory trainings in the organization, which has a very high bar to make something mandatory for a workforce of over 20,000 plus. And data literacy got the support to be approved as a mandatory course, which almost all of the workforce has gone through over the last year as mandatory training. So we ensure that people have this minimum understanding of what data is, what good quality data is, what's their role in it, the governance and ethics, and all the privacy considerations. So a lot more of educating and enabling the workforce from a data point of view. So that helped us because we always knew AI was coming. Even when I joined, there was lots of positioning around AI. But fortunately, we got everyone to understand you need to deal with the data dynamic first, because data and AI go together very strongly. And without good data, without high quality data, without the right data, AI ambitions will come short. And I think many are learning that. So the good thing for us is we started that, and we have now made strong progress on good data infrastructure with enterprise thinking. We have strong data governance. We have data ethics. We have a global privacy office. We have an ethics office. So we have all the procedural and policy guardrails around data, and have implemented that and are actioning it. So we've actually, moved from principle to practice, where when we build systems, we build it with things like governance by design or ethics by design. So it's built into the system, as opposed to afterwards trying to figure out, well, how have we protected it? Have we made sure we have permission to use the data? We do those things upfront, especially if it's PII, if it's privacy data. We make sure we have the permission, we are using it for purposes as intended, and that everything is safe and secure from an infrastructure point of view. So we have the cyber controls and all the technical controls as well to ensure we have best-in-class technology to protect the data. So, and especially in our case, the work we do and the people we engage with, these are vulnerable populations who entrust us with the data, so they place reliance on us, and we can't betray that trust. To date, we have been very strong in demonstrating that we can be trusted. So that, I think, put us in a good shape from a people literacy or a people journey point of view, from an infrastructure point of view, governance and ethics, and all the foundations around data, and shifting the organization over the last 2 years to enterprise thinking on data. So that's where we are as an organization, and making steady progress and good progress, but there's still a journey ahead to get there. And then second to that, that converges now with the whole, energy around artificial intelligence. So there's a lot on the go. There has been for the longest time. But even, people that, lead on AI will tell you that your data needs to be good. So now that we're there, similarly for the artificial intelligence strategy, we followed the same process. It's a WFP, World Food Program artificial intelligence strategy. It is not a technology strategy. So you won't find in either the data strategy or the AI strategy reference to technology, to technology firms, or anything technical. It's lifted up to a point where it's about the organization. It gets into those sorts of topics, but without getting locked into anything that gets into specific technologies or technical details. Again, it was something we consulted widely across the organization, so that everybody feels a sense of ownership and a sense of having shaped it, because everybody wants to latch onto AI, and everybody has a view of what it is and what it can do. So again, the dimensions around the artificial intelligence strategy was again get the infrastructure right. So get the data infrastructure, the AI infrastructure like compute and processing, AI models, etc., so that we have those things documented for reusability. And that's a principle we echo throughout both our data and AI strategies, is the principle of reusability, because our resources, our funding have become tighter by the day and by the year. So we have now, look to these avenues on how we do things more cost effectively. So how can we take the same funding and get a further reach than we currently do? Because funding is not going up, it's actually going down. But the people we need to help are going up. So there's a disproportionate movement in both those metrics. So that's so similarly with artificial intelligence, we made strides on our architecture. We made movements on AI literacy, where we launched AI literacy programs to educate and train people and enable them. We looked at partnerships, so where we partner with academic institutions, with government entities, we're already part of the World Food Program, and then private sector. Private sector is a big lever for us because they've got deep pockets and have already made massive investments and strides, and we're looking at how do we now leverage their work, either through them bringing in some expertise in a partnership, non-commercial arrangement, or whether it's through funding or whether it's through their infrastructure, like using their compute and the supercomputers and so on. And even some government entities are offering us that through their local private sector. And then the ethics, the whole ethics of AI is, everybody's favorite question on AI. How do you make sure there's no bias? How do you make sure it's there's no, the results are reliable? How do you make sure there's human control? So all of those things are called out in our strategy and dealt with, and more specifically in a more detailed AI governance document where we're clear on what technologies we use, because ones that we cannot control, do not have visibility, or at risk of data leakage or loss, we control those technically, and those are not allowed on the official landscape. I mean, of course, people in their personal capacity and laptops could do things, but officially on the World Food Program domain, it's controlled and restricted physically. You can imagine that doesn't make us popular with some people because everybody wants to use their favorite AI tool. And again, it's a bit of education to get them to understand that, hey, if you put an ethics report, as an ethics officer, if you put an ethics report in some publicly available tool, that information which is private is now in the public domain. Right. So we need them, we're getting them there to understand that, because they don't understand the challenges. They just see the buzz and the excitement around what a tool can do. So we're using approved tools that we know are safe and reliable, and we've put the guardrails around it and have done education. We're working with partners, and then certainly we're working closely again with the Global Privacy Office and with our ethics office, and even our risk management teams to put all those guardrails in place. When we use models, we're very clear about training those with reflective data sets, that it just doesn't work for one scenario and fail for others, especially given the wide demographics around the world that we work on. So we make sure we do that in a safe, controlled manner, and that we have reliance on the tools. We even have brought in external partners to review those models, especially where we use open source, to critique it, to say, is there any risk around using this? Is there any reputational damage we could inherit by using it? And then to check for the robustness and for, lack of bias in the tool. And then we've also put in controls to keep the models fresh, because models can get stale over time and bias can creep in. So we've also taken measures to do that. And as an organization, we again operating with an enterprise lens, where we publish the models in a reusable library. So where models have been vetted and used, and again, so people don't have to go redo something if they're solving a particular problem. and don't need to go revet it. And then it's only if it's not in the library, we then deploy new models depending on the type of problem we're trying to solve. So, and then we've done many projects on artificial intelligence, from, food resilience to emergency response to beneficiary management, where we've used data to, you can imagine we've got millions of records collected over the years, again, because of past practices, a lot of duplicates. And we've, our motto is we have human in the loop for AI. So there's always a human being, an expert viewing the output before the output is accepted. And our view on AI is for human augmentation, not for human replacement, because we cannot hire all the people we'd like to. So what we'd like to use AI for is to augment those skills, is take those experts and scale them through AI bots that, where we can't hire humans. And the work we've done some of that is where we've managed to use AI, and some of your leading questions on data, it's just lying out there. What are we doing with it? So we're actually, refining those data sets to get them, down to more reliable data sets to understand what's our true base and remove duplicates. And you have used AI successfully in some pilot countries, where we've shown returns on the investment in the order of 20%, where we've run some pilot use cases. And what it means for us, you have a potential of redeploying existing funds to a much broader reach of that community, because you're now not over-serving somebody 2 or 3 times and somebody else not getting served at all. So I'll pause there, Roisin. I know it's a long answer, but there's so much we can share with you, but I'll pause there.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting to hearing about the approach that you've taken to it. And I think for me, the most interesting part is that I've always felt like the use and utilization of data in the humanitarian sector is a human problem, right? So a lot of the steps that you've taken around data literacy, and not just making it a kind of technological problem, and kind of recognizing even with the AI rollout that, people get excited by the possibilities and want to kind of see what can be done without stopping to think, should they be done? Is this an appropriate thing to be done? So I think probably a good moment now to bring in Nimesh and share some of his questions around the sort of ethics and data and his expertise on that.
Yeah, thank you, Roisin. I have a few slides actually, so if that's okay to. Can you see it? Right. Okay. Thank you, Roisin and Magan. You made my work much easier, because I think it's basically builds on what you've already said. I'm just trying to make maybe a little bit concrete, based on my own work as a disaster and development scholar, and who's someone who's interested in politics of data in disaster context. So that's really something that I specialize in, and I've been kind of looking at it through different theoretical and also in empirical contexts. And I think it's basically kind of raises some fundamental questions that Roisin was started with, in terms of how data is conceptualized and applied in disaster context, which we know is characterized by vulnerability, deprivation, but also political sensitivity. So how we think about data and how we kind of collect data in these contexts. So it just also raises some really crucial ethical questions. It also means that whether we collect data for scientific purpose as a scholar, or for programmatic decision making in terms of who we want to target for humanitarian aid, how we approach our humanitarian aid beneficiaries, and all sort of question. But it could also mean like data for advocacy purposes. So it's something, one of my recent works is also focused on how civil society work as early warning agents, and so sort of really trying to turn information into data for various forms of claim making. So that's also something I think that we need to be taking into account. That's going beyond conventional international humanitarian organization, how local communities are also using data for advocacy and accountability purposes. But also the questions about when we are talking about data collection, it also raises questions about who are involved in data collection process. These scholars or practitioners. Often we have local communities or local researchers who are involved in this process of data collection. So one of our work with on that was funded by the British Academy Foundation, where I worked as a co-investigator. We were looking at the ethics of data collection in three post-conflict, post-disaster contexts: Nepal, Colombia, and Serbia. And we're really looking at different forms of data collection processes that can explicitly or implicitly pose harm to communities or local researchers who are involved in this process, right? So it's also very important to think about who is involved in this data collection process. The other sort of important issue is also, I mean, I also think it is was an excellent segue what Magan was talking about in terms of the growing involvement of consulting groups or big tech companies or other kinds of actors in this process. And one of the work that I recently was involved in is to really look at this idea of crisis prediction in the humanitarian sector, like so both in disaster or in conflict and other kinds of crisis that we are increasingly involved in predicting in the context of climate fuel disaster or but also other kinds of disaster. And we are looking at it in this paper through this idea of data work, which basically examines the praxis of data or technology-driven data collection. And this really means is to really look at the behind-the-scenes practices that happened in data collection, like different forms of partnership that are forged in collecting data, the activities, and also sort of the very mundane kind of processes in terms of collecting, cleaning, sharing, reusing data, as Magan was pointing out. And this is not just an abstract issue. As you can see, there are a number of different initiatives that are happening globally under Early Warning for All, which has been really pushed by the UN in the recent years. Basically meaning like providing early warning to communities who are affected by disaster. It's also involved initiatives that involve developing data ecosystem, which are trying to address some of the issues that Magan was talking about in the context where there's problems of data duplication. Trying to develop processes that would help consolidate and data on crisis prediction. There's also a lot of open source kind of publishing of data. So as you are probably aware of the humanitarian data exchange, where people can actually go and put data online, and that's been increasingly being used in humanitarian crisis prediction. But also, as I said, like involvement of different actors, like data scientists, consultants, big tech companies in this process, and how it is shaping the practice of data prediction is also a crucial question. So in this paper that was published in Big Data and Society, Gianluca Lozanino and we are basically posing some themes and questions that I think that is very important for this sector. One is, I think it in many ways, I agree with both Roisin and Magan that there are some long-standing questions about the humanitarian actors working in silos. There's lots of data hoarding that Roisin pointed out, from her work from a decade ago. But I think I also agree with Magan about the sector has, at least the paper shows that the sector has moved a little bit forward in terms of sharing of data. There's an increased appreciation for the value of data minimization, if you will, right? Sort of not collecting data that is not required and that can actually pose harm to the communities. And one of our research found that really that we know that often communities are subjected over data collection. So that's also one of the reasons that there's been an increased effort around data consolidation and data sharing. One of the interviews in our paper was basically kind of really in a positive light. This idea of data collection sharing was seen as, before it was people were working in silos, different worlds of data collection, and now it's coming together in terms of sharing, reusing of data. But also it raises a number of questions about sort of a paradox that we found, that although there is a shift towards data sharing, but humanitarian actors who we interviewed also see that there's a great deal of scarcity about around data that needs to be used, consolidated for predicting, especially complex and multifaceted crisis, and often we call it cascading crisis. For example, conflict and disaster coming together, right? So how do you predict those? So there's also, although there has been effort to kind of bring data together through these efforts, there's also the humanitarian actors are also facing constraints around data in order to predict these new and emerging crises. We also found that quite a bit of power dynamics around data sharing, data reuse, particularly because of the new actors who are coming in this process, big tech, consulting groups. Quite a bit of outsourcing of data also happening from the humanitarian sector, because humanitarian actors, particularly traditional humanitarian actors, tend to have limited in-house capabilities to process data and apply data. So there's quite a bit of outsourcing of that, and that raises some really interesting questions around, again, data sharing, data safeguarding, but also accountability, as Magan was saying. What if there's data leakage, right, or misuse of data? Who is to be held accountable for that? So I think those are some of the real important questions that the paper raises. And then the third point is around the tension around the integration of small and big data. So obviously, there's quite a bit of focus on big data, particularly as the machine learning, artificial intelligence has come into picture, sort of like using historical data to predict future crises. And so inevitably, there's a lot of focus on big data that is out there. But what about small data? What about contextual data, qualitative data? And so how do we integrate that into the process? And what we found in the paper is that although there is appreciation for contextual data, local data, but the humanitarian actors who are involved in this process of prediction, they also thought that there is far less kind of attention to contextual and local data, and a lot more is being focused on historical and big data. And so that also raises a fundamental question that if you're focusing on a certain type of data versus other, is there a risk that we are better or better at predicting certain types of crisis than others? And that really raises the question about humanitarian epistemics, like what gets prioritized, what doesn't get what gets lost in the process. Are there certain disasters that have a risk being invisibilized in this process if you are really focusing on a certain type of data? So I think I'll end with those three questions here, really about that touches on what do we think about, how good, where are we in terms of predicting multifaceted, complex, new kind of crisis? One, the question again about when there are new actors involved in this process, how do we rethink about data sharing, safeguarding, and also accountability? And third is really the question about is there a risk of certain crises getting more attention than others in the process of collecting and using data? And I'll end there. Thanks so much.
Thanks a lot, Nimesh. So we have still 20 minutes more. If you have any questions, you can put it in the chat box, but I will take on what you have said. I also find it very interesting. So I will pose this question to Magan. Nimesh also highlighted the importance of field-based qualitative data. So how do you also value or prioritize these qualitative small data. I believe that WFP also collects beyond these surveys qualitative data as well. When big data meets with these kind of qualitative data, how do you approach to this one? If I may, I also want to ask any a further question related to operational strategy. So it's striking to see that actually you have highlighted it's a business strategy, it's not a digital strategy. But does this require some sort of a redefinition of operational model at WFP? Does this require some sort of a restructuring of its operational concept? So these are the two questions. One is related to qualitative data, the other one is operational context. I really appreciate if you elaborate on these questions a lot, Megan. Thanks.
Sure, thanks very much, Ümit, and thanks, Nimesh, for that overview. Very interesting, very insightful. I think it touched on very key, pertinent issues as well that have been trending for a while. So the first one, Ümit, I mean, yeah, we look at all data and the opportunity that they all represent. I think obviously the big data are the ones people go after first because of the value it holds. And we're certainly leveraging big data in terms of emergency response, supply chain operations, where we get more optimal with moving food into corridors more efficiently, ahead of time, more cost effectively. Because a lot of the work we're doing ultimately around data and AI connect to impact to the people we serve, and then driving our cost of operations down and driving our efficiencies up as principles. So whatever it is, it needs to connect to those things. So big things like that absolutely help. We're using other projects where we're using satellite imagery, and just recently I met an organization that's collecting some interesting satellite data that they say nobody else is, where they're not just soil samples but collecting temperature data as well, which they're willing to make available to us at no cost. And they were willing to make their AI models available. So what that does is give you an opportunity to predict drought weeks ahead before it physically manifests. Where you physically start seeing things happening, people then it's going to give an opportunity. So again, getting ahead of emergencies and crisis, where we would hopefully have weeks lead time to respond to drought situation before it takes hold of the community. And then, they can do some interventions like start watering actively or something else. But in terms of the field data, absolutely, we build in the idea of quality at the source now as we move forward. We don't see anything as inconsequential. So we're looking at all data, whether it's something as big as satellite data or something like beneficiary information we collect at the communities we engage with, where in our world there's a phrase called targeting. So even that data is collected and profile to say, well, who is the most needy, because our funds can't serve everybody. So then there's a methodology they go through that say, well, based on the data collected, this is who we target. They store that information, then subsequent targeting campaigns need to filter out previous people that were targeted and target new people for assistance. So it's a lot of on-the-ground use of the data in real time in local communities. It is data where we're trying to run interventions to build resilience into local communities. So not just these big grand AI projects that are multi-month or year and big costs, but where you can run small projects where, local communities can build food resilience. I mean, ultimately, the World Food Program is trying to solve world hunger. And these are all the other methods that can help, where you can get communities to self-serve, and then, find you can assist others. So that's on the data side. In terms of the strategy, I mean, good call out, good note. Absolutely. That is how we positioned it, as a business strategy or an organizational strategy, not a technology strategy. And one is that everybody then has an ownership and understands they have a role to play on it, and don't just look on as bystanders and say, oh, it's tech's job. It's the technologies team job to deploy AI and make it a reality and get the benefits from it. So with that in mind, if the way we've articulated the strategy by them co-owning it and co-writing, I mean, we took the lead on it, or I took the lead on it, but had them co-write it. It was a natural way of positioning for the model to support it. So we don't have to do any extensive reorganizational or operations management. I think it's more about how we embed it into our current practices and make it a way of work, as opposed to doing something differently and creating a huge change management overhead. And that, I think, was one of the fears in the beginning, where people were like, is AI going to take my job, and is it going to do certain things? And for us as an organization, I mean, we only launched our AI strategy formally February last year, so a little over a year ago, but we started to make inroads on it a little bit before. But if I look at a year later, where I consulted the organization, and a lot of it was around fear, a lot of it now is they've embraced the opportunity it represents. They've heard about it, they've tried things on their own, and they want to now leverage it for themselves and their teams for operational efficiencies, impact to the communities we serve, and opportunity to scale up and do things we couldn't perhaps previously do. So, for example, that example on removing duplication using photo data is an extremely difficult and costly thing to do given the volumes. But now, once you train AI and make a bit of investment in AI, it can do that for you. I mean, traditionally, you'd probably look at 1 million of records or more and say, oh, this is not achievable and perhaps not even attempted as humans. But with AI, you now have an opportunity to solve problems you could not solve before. So it's really kind of how we embrace it and how we leverage it, as opposed to changing structures and operating models.
Thanks a lot. I have a follow-up question regarding the disadvantaged communities. So we know that there are millions of people who don't have any access to electricity, let aside connection. But does this strategy means that there is some sort of exclusion within this concept, or how do you address this?
Yeah, that comes up a lot. It's a really good question, Umit, because around AI are things like connectivity, power, and maybe some other things that are perhaps a bit of a blind spot, because everybody focuses on, okay, AI. But there's some precursors. Right? Without power, you can't run the models. Without connectivity, you cannot run the models. So we've taken a holistic view. You called out our digital strategy earlier, and that's what it's about, taking a holistic view of the problem at hand and not just zooming in on something specific, but saying we need to take into account power, connectivity, cyber controls, etc., which come together in support of the AI ambition. So the way we're solving that currently is where we do have those challenges, we're building solutions that can work in offline mode, so that you don't need the connectivity. You can go out and do things, then bring it back to where you have connectivity and sync everything up. It's not optimal, but it gives us a way of moving forward. And then, one of the projects we're running with smallholding farmers of building resilience into the food supply. We know they don't have the infrastructure or the funding for that. So the idea really is to build those products and produce the result, and for them to consume the result as opposed to use the artificial intelligence. And that's really how we're trying to address those problems.
Okay, thanks. My last question is some sort of organizational barrier within this transformation. Could you also talk a little bit about the barriers, the problems that you have encountered in this process, like from an organizational perspective? And then I will hand over to Nimesh and Roisin for further questions.
Absolutely. Thanks, Ümit. Yeah, it hasn't been without challenges. I think the biggest one is, around the whole change dynamics, what people call change management. So I think the first one was really around fear, was the fear of AI. That was something we really had to deal with and put on the table and call out and address it openly and transparently. So, and I think people had an appreciation for that. And then there's also the concerns around controls around it. Like, will it just operate autonomously? Will I lose control? So we've addressed those as well. And then, the whole ethics and bias components, which also have been challenges. And how do we demonstrate to the organization and our member states who fund us that we have all of those things in hand. So those have been the challenges. Of course, funding capacity and all the underlying things to execute have been a challenge. I think we have clarity in the direction. We have the intent to execute, but some of the things we need to execute, given our organization, are a bit of a challenge. Where I've attended many sessions and AI and data sessions over the years, and it's always about a call to action for those who can partner with us to partner with us and enable us.
Roisin, please go ahead. Thanks a lot, Magan.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's really interesting. I was thinking about what you were saying about how you've been kind of assessing the data to identify the most vulnerable communities. And one of the things, certainly from my research in conflict context, is that there are huge data gaps in terms of communities that there's just no access to because of conflict, because of violence. There's communities cut off. And I worry a little bit about, and I think this is some of what Nimesh was talking about in terms of prediction, about the kind of path dependency that can emerge through the kind of aggregation of data and then further kind of feeding into AI decision making around it. It's like, what about where we know there are data gaps? How do we overcome that problem? Another way I think this manifests is that we know that very often data misses specific issues that women face, right? There's lots and lots of recorded challenges in terms of gender biases around data collection in many communities. And is there a kind of path dependency that is potentially a risk in terms of how we use that data, and where we know that we have data missing about the experiences of some communities? How do we ensure that their vulnerability is not overlooked in those models?
Thanks, Roisin. That's a really good grounded question, right? Because some of the things I reflected on when I joined. How do we know, after everything we do, that we're getting to the person we need to get to? And it's not an easy one to answer. The organization has many controls in place, through its own interventions, through the member states who conduct independent audits and assessment and bring new information. And there's, I think, an independent evaluations department that report directly to the board. So there's lots of checks and balances to sense check it, but that doesn't mean that there's no gaps. There could potentially be a case, and I think it's something we would have to address over time as we get more targeted on leveraging the data we have and spot anomalies on it, and use tools like AI to spot the anomalies, which we're busy doing, because the AI is now picking up things like, a household has 3 heads when it should have 1. Somebody in a household is 152 years old. AI is picking these things out where humans couldn't. So we are busy going through a process to pick up anomalies and then fix that. But where there are data gaps, interestingly, we turn to things that are not technology heavy. We turn to partners on the ground, and yes, some of these situations are high conflict, highly dangerous, very difficult to access. The organization has had a model over the years where it partners with local partners who have access or take the risk on our behalf to get into those communities and physically collect the data. So those are the interventions. Again, they're not foolproof and they're not optimal and they're not slick, but it's measures we have in place where we have those gaps of how best to plug the gaps.
Thanks a lot, Magan. Nimesh, the floor is yours for the last question. We have 5 minutes left.
I mean, if anybody else I can, because we only have 5 minutes.
I didn't receive any question in the chat box, but please feel free to ask your question.
Yeah, just a quick question about qualitative data, Magan, because it's really good to hear that you you also look for contextual and field-based data. But it seems there's sort of less interest, or I don't know, around the sharing of qualitative data compared to quantitative data, right? So it's if you're really looking at satellite data or survey data, so there's quite a bit of sharing of those data compared to field-based. And I wonder if you could, is there something inherently difficult in sharing qualitative data that you found in your work? Because is it like people are less inclined to do so, or they think that it is too contextual, that it is not worthy of sharing, or there are other kind of ethical concerns that are more prominent in those qualitative data? So just wondering if you could, what are the, my principal or operational issues that can come in, so, pose a barrier in sharing qualitative data compared to quantitative data?
Thanks, Nimesh. I mean, it's a really great question. Data sharing comes up a lot. It is a challenge. I don't think just for us, but many organizations. So I think in our strategy, we have reference to the idea of democratizing data, where we want to make it available and people can self-serve. But I think with that, there are the consideration around privacy and ethics, which often come up, where people cite that and say, look, I don't have permission to share this, and those sorts of things. Then I think there's also the commoditization of data, where a lot of that data that you refer to is actually commoditized. It's paid data. So then people are reluctant to share. And then and that's around the access to data. So again, how do you level all of that? How do you open it up and kind of take the competitiveness of it out of there? And I've seen I've previously worked in the financial services industry, so they're highly competitive. But one of the things they share openly is fraud data, because there's no competitive advantage on that, and they all benefit from it. There's a mutual benefit, because if somebody's committed fraud on bank A, bank B will want to be alerted so they don't open an account and also lose money on that person. So I think short answer to a question, in our context, in any context, you want to find that happy medium where the data being shared is not viewed as competitive or risky or breaching any rules, and it's one where there's mutual benefit to everybody. So it's, if you could share the insights and everybody's comfortable that, look, this is mutually beneficial, then I think that's a good place to be. Again, it's an aspiration. We've launched many campaigns around data sharing. We, over the years, have managed to share data with some agencies, but not many. And I think those took many years of legal work to get to that point. So it's often the ethics around it and the privacy considerations that come up, I think, that become the barriers to sharing.
Thanks, Salat. So I think this concludes our webinar. I really appreciate all of you. Thank you, Magan, for generously sharing your time and expertise with us today. It was really so insightful. I personally find it so interesting and insightful. And I also want to thank Nimesh and Roisin for this very relevant research. I hope it will be also useful for our participants, for our graduate students and staff. So this concludes the webinar. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Ümit. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks
so
Magan.
much.
Thanks.
Thank
Have a
you.
good day.
Bye-bye. Bye.